vCenter Orchestrator, that's the monster that is hidden in your vCenter installation. It is not scalable, it's not reliable, and it is very, very complex, so that if you want to start using it, it even shows your teeth and scares you away before you get started. Well, these are rumors that I want to demystify with this session. My name is Joerg Lew. I'm working for VMware, and I blog on vcoportal.de, and I want to share my experience with VCO to help you get rid over these fears about vCenter Orchestrator. Let's talk about these rumors. So VCO not being reliable, well, that is just not true. In VCO you have a lot of different technologies available that help you to build really enterprise-ready and reliable workflows. So there is that concept of exception handling, for example, that allows you to keep the workflow under control even if things go wrong in your infrastructure. It's like exception handling in any other programming language. That means you can react on errors and maybe even automatically correct these errors within your workflow. Then we also have a clustering functionality built in VCO that allows you to have multiple VCO instances connected to the same database, and all these instances share the runtime information of the workflows, which is stored in the database. So that means if you have that cluster, you can have an active-active or active-passive cluster, and if one of the VCO server that actually runs your workflows crashes, then the other VCO instance will just take over the running workflows, and the workflows will continue to run. So VCO for sure is a very reliable solution for your automation. Then let's talk about scalability. With VCO, a single VCO instance allows you to run up to 300 concurrent running workflows at the same time. So that means you can actually do a lot of stuff with a single VCO instance. And these 300 running workflows are really workflows that are currently being processed. They are actively doing something. So if you have workflows that wait for external systems to answer, then usually you put these workflows in a waiting state, and that means they do not even count towards these 300 concurrent running workflows. And that's just a single instance. As mentioned, it is possible to cluster VCO, to have multiple VCO instances, and each of these instances brings in 300 concurrent running workflows. So it's very easy to scale out your VCO infrastructure. And there's even more. In a larger environment where you might have multiple data centers or multiple locations for your automation, where you want to automate things in these data centers, you even can use tools like the VCO REST API or the multi-node plugin that allows you to automate and orchestrate other orchestrator servers. So that means you can have a distributed VCO environment with different VCO instances in these different data centers, and still be able to manage them from a central orchestrator instance. So that allows you to even scale out more. Then, let's come to the rumor that VCO is complex and it scares you away before you even get started. Well, VCO obviously is not as simple to get started with as PowerCLI, for example, where you just can do a simple get cluster, pipe to get VM, pipe to get snapshot, pipe to out HTML to create a report of all your snapshots in the environment. It's not that easy, but it is quite smooth to get started these days. Back in the older days, a couple of years ago, even the installation and the setup of VCO was quite complex to achieve. But nowadays we have the VCO appliance that allows you to just roll out a virtual machine, and appliance comes pre-configured with database and an LDAP authentication service within, so you're up and running. Also, now to get started with using workflows, even that's quite straightforward, because with your orchestrator, and especially with the vCenter plugin, there are already hundreds of workflows in the workflow library. that you can use and run out of the box. The complex part comes in when you really actually want to develop your own workflows. But as mentioned, you don't have to start with that. Just deploy VCO and use one of the hundreds of workflows that come with the plugins, and you can use them out of the box and already gain a lot of automation in your infrastructure. If you really want to develop your own workflows then my recommendation is start simple. Do not pick or try to solve a very, very complex task from the beginning, but start simple. And usually the best way really to learn VCO is that you think about, as a vSphere administrator, you think about the silliest task you have to do more than once in your environment. That becomes a very, very good candidate to being automated with VCO workflows. And since it is a very stupid task that you have to do more than once, you likely will be very motivated to automate it away so you don't have to do it manually anymore. So that is your candidate to get started with workflow development. Now to get started, that is now where the big step in the learning curve for VCO comes in, because you have to understand the concept of parameter binding, that you really understand how the workflows work. Now, for that concept, we do have some videos available, 3 videos available on www.vmwarelearning.com/orchestrator. That's, I think, over 2 hours of free videos that help you get started with VCO. The main idea of parameter binding is that within a workflow, you usually have multiple elements. So you have a single starting point for your workflow, and then you have different steps in the workflow. And then depending on the branching, you might have multiple endpoints for your workflow, where your workflow can finish. And in VCO, it is never ever possible to transfer information directly from one element to another element. You always have to do the so-called parameter binding. So that means each of your workflow elements, be it a scriptable task, be it a decision element, or be it another workflow that you want to call, each of these workflow elements has its own in and out parameters that allows you to send information towards that element or to read information from that element. And you have to bind these in and out parameters for each single workflow element to your global workflow attributes. So these workflow attributes, they are persisted in the database whenever the workflow is being processed and one workflow element has finished to process. Then the VCO platform persists the whole state, all the attributes of that running workflow in the database, which brings in, again, reliability, the so-called checkpointing. So that means even if the VCO server crashes, since all the runtime state of the workflows is persisted in the database, the workflow can just be resumed when you restart the server or on another instance in your cluster. That's the reason, technically, why we need that parameter binding. The parameter binding also really forces you to think about what information you need in every single workflow element. And then you have to, either using the visual binding tab, but drag and drop, or using the ins and out tabs to configure these bindings, specify which in parameter or which out parameter of your single workflow element should be bound to what workflow attribute. So the workflow attributes, VCO uses static typing. So that means for each of these attributes, you have to define a type. You also have to define a name as an identifier for this attribute. Then you define the type. You actually can put in some initial value for that attribute, and you can do a description. Make sure to use the description fields because they allow you to document the workflow inside the workflow. There's usually no need to maintain an external documentation. Now, these types again, they come from the plugin. They might be plain basic JavaScript types like a string or a number or a Boolean true-false value. But all the more complex types, they come in from the plugin. So for example, the vCenter plugin brings in types like a virtual machine, an ESX host system, a cluster, a data store, a resource pool. If you, I don't know, use the database plugin, then your database tables might become, or are types that are provided by these plugins. And since VCO uses a strict typing, you have to make sure that when you do the parameter binding and you use that attribute then as a variable in your JavaScript, that you only fill in values that are of that given type. It's like if you have, I'm from Bavaria, so I like to use beer glasses as an example for that. If your attribute is of a type of a white beer glass, for example, you do not fill in some Pilsner beer into that. Do not try that in Bavaria. You will surely get kicked out. On the other side, if you have a Pilsner glass, then you do not fill in some white beer. That just does not work. Another plugin for our Italian friends, for example, bring in some coffee, cups of coffee. It's the same story. If you have a cappuccino cup, you do not fill in espresso towards that. For the guys from France, it's about wine glasses. You cannot pour white wine in a red wine glass, obviously. So you get the point. So VCO uses strict typing for these attributes. You have to match the value, the type of the value, to the attribute. And then, that's the way using these attributes to pass information from one element to another element. You use the out binding from your first workflow element, bind it to the workflow attribute, and then use the same attribute and bind it as in parameter into the second workflow element. And so the second workflow element can actually access the value of that workflow attribute. That is so-called parameter binding, the key concept of VCO. And that is the big step in your path to learn how to use VCO and how to develop workflows, to master that concept of parameter binding. And when you are over that concept, like using the videos we have on vmwarelearning.com/orchestrator, then eventually you will recognize that, VCO is not really that beast that you think it is. And it brings some very, very powerful automation capabilities for you. Thank you.